What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 9.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and give you my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL this week. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to dominate your season-long fantasy leagues. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football leagues. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Once again, guys, sorry for the echo on the audio of this video. Gonna have that fixed soon. Okay, guys, NFL Week 9. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. I'm gonna start Josh Allen from the Buffalo Bills playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Josh Allen has averaged 25.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.3 rush attempts per game. Now, he only scored 14 fantasy points last game. It was a bad weather game, so throw that score out of there. He did have 10 rush attempts that game and 11 rush attempts in the game before that. He's projected at 21.2 fantasy points here in Week 9, and he's 7,000 DraftKings salary and 1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, and they have the Buffalo Bills trailing by 3. So fantastic matchup here. It should be a passing game script. So I'm going to start Josh Allen here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Another quarterback I'm going to start is Matthew Stafford from the Detroit Lions playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the fourth most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Matthew Stafford has averaged 19.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.4 rush attempts per game. He scored 27 and 21 fantasy points in the last 2 games, projected at 18.6 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's 6,600 DraftKings salary and 900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 53 points scored in this game, with the Detroit Lions trailing by 3.5. So another fantastic matchup here, high scoring game and a passing game script. So despite the injury to Kenny Golladay, I'm going to start Matthew Stafford here versus the Minnesota Vikings. And another quarterback I'm going to start is Ben Roethlisberger from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 14th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Ben Roethlisberger has averaged 18.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.4 rush attempts per game. Now, he hasn't produced a lot of fantasy points the last 3 weeks, only scoring 15, 16, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games. But now he's got a fantastic matchup versus an awful Dallas secondary, and he's projected at 17.6 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's 6,500 DraftKings salary and 1,200 more on FanDuel. So I love this matchup for Ben Roethlisberger. All of his wide receivers are healthy. They should be able to tear that Dallas secondary apart. So I'm going to start Ben Roethlisberger here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Okay, what quarterback are we going to sit here in Week 9? I'm going to sit Teddy Bridgewater from the Carolina Panthers playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have the third best defense overall, and they give up the sixth fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Teddy Bridgewater has averaged 17.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.8 rush attempts per game. He scored 13, 19, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games, projected at 19.8 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's 6,000 DraftKings salary and 1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Carolina Panthers trailing by 11.5. So I just don't like the matchup here. Although it should be a passing game script for Teddy Bridgewater, the Kansas City Chiefs have a fantastic defense. I don't think Teddy Bridgewater is going to hit that 19.8 projected fantasy points this week. So I'm going to sit Teddy Bridgewater here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. This one may be an obvious start, but I'm going to start James Robinson from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Houston Texans, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing running backs. James Robinson has averaged 20.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 15.3 rush attempts per game and 4.6 pass targets per game. He scored 35, 15, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 22 rush attempts and 6 pass targets last game. He's projected at 15.5 fantasy points here in Week 9, and he's 7,000 DraftKings salary and 300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Jacksonville Jaguars trailing by 6. So this game should be close enough, and James Robinson is involved in the passing game. Fantastic matchup here, so I'm going to start James Robinson here versus the Houston Texans. Another running back I'm going to start is Myles Gaskin from the Miami Dolphins playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Myles Gaskin has averaged 14.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.3 rush attempts per game and 5 pass targets per game. He scored 14, 17, and 20 fantasy points in the last 3 games, and he got 18 rush attempts in the last 2 games and 6 and 4 pass targets. So tons of volume for Myles Gaskin. He's projected at 14.6 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's 5,900 DraftKings salary and the same price on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Dolphins trailing by 4.5. So mostly due to the fact that Myles Gaskin has gotten over 20 touches in the last 3 weeks, on volume alone, I'm going to start Myles Gaskin here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Okay, another running back I'm going to start is David Johnson from the Houston Texans playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. David Johnson has averaged 13.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.4 rush attempts per game and 3.4 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 79% of the snaps, and he scored 17, 14, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks. He's projected at 15.7 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's 5,600 DraftKings salary and 1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Houston Texans favored by 6. So I like this matchup here. Great matchup, pretty high scoring game, and the Houston Texans are favored, so it could be a running game script here. So I'm going to start David Johnson here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Okay, who are we going to sit at the running back position? Despite a decent matchup here, I'm going to sit Devin Singletary from the Buffalo Bills playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the second worst defense overall and they're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Devin Singletary has averaged 10.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.6 rush attempts per game and 3.8 pass targets per game. He's only scored 10, 7, and 6 fantasy points in the last 3 games, projected at 10.5 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $4,700 DraftKings salary and $1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Buffalo Bills trailing by 3. So my problem with Devin Singletary is he's sharing the ball with Zach Moss, who looks to be taking over the backfield and scoring the touchdowns in the red zone. And he also has to compete with Josh Allen, who runs the ball quite a bit. So I'm going to sit Devin Singletary here versus the Seattle Seahawks.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. No obvious starts for you here, so maybe you're a little thin at the wide receiver position and you're not sure what guy to play. I'm going to start Chase Claypool from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Chase Claypool has averaged 15.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.9 pass targets per game. Now, even with Deontay Johnson back, he got 9 pass targets last game, scored 14 fantasy points. He's projected at 10.3 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $5,700 DraftKings salary and $600 more on FanDuel. So you can make a case for any of these Pittsburgh Steelers wide receivers: Chase Claypool, Juju Smith-Schuster, Deontay Johnson. I wouldn't play more than one, but if you have one of those guys on your roster, or if you're playing DFS, go ahead and plug them into your lineup. Fantastic matchup here versus a bad Dallas Cowboys defense. So I'm going to start Chase Claypool here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Okay, for one of my favorite starts of the week, I'm going to start Marvin Jones Jr. from the Detroit Lions playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Marvin Jones Jr. has averaged 9.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.3 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 90% of the snaps, and he scored 19 fantasy points last week off of 7 pass targets. He's projected at 9.6 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $5,100 DraftKings salary and $1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 53 points scored in this game, and they have the Detroit Lions trailing by 3.5. So fantastic matchup here, high scoring game, passing game script, and Kenny Golladay is going to be out this week, so that's going to be a bump in targets for Marvin Jones Jr. So that means an increased target share for Marvin Jones Jr. who's a fantastic wide receiver. He just needs more opportunity, which he's going to get here in week 9. So I'm going to start Marvin Jones Jr. here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, if you're struggling at the wide receiver position, I'm going to start Darnell Mooney from the Chicago Bears playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Darnell Mooney has averaged 8.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.4 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 67% of the snaps. He scored 18 fantasy points last week off of 6 pass targets. His volume is pretty good. He got 6, 7, and 5 pass targets in the past 3 weeks, and he's projected at 9 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $3,900 DraftKings salary and $1,600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Chicago Bears trailing by 5.5. Now, great matchup here. It should be a passing game script. So we've seen that the Tennessee Titans have some chinks in the armor on the defensive side of the ball. So great matchup here and a passing game script. So I'm going to start Darnell Mooney or Anthony Miller from the Chicago Bears here versus the Tennessee Titans. Anthony Miller, he got 11 pass targets last week, scored 15 fantasy points. These Chicago Bears wide receivers have a great matchup here this week. So if you're struggling at the wide receiver position, you need a streamer to fill in your flex, or if you're looking for a low salary DFS play, take a look at Anthony Miller or Darnell Mooney here from the Chicago Bears. Okay, who are we going to sit at the wide receiver position? I'm going to sit Golden Tate from the New York Giants playing the Washington Football Team, who have a good defense overall, and they give up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Golden Tate has averaged 7.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.3 pass targets per game. Now, he's coming off of a game versus the Tampa Bay Bucks where he scored a touchdown, so you may be enticed to give Golden Tate the start based on last week's performance. So last week, although the Tampa Bay Bucks have a good defense overall, Golden Tate had one of the best matchups on the slate versus Sean Murphy Bunting, who gives up a ton of fantasy points per route run against. That's not the case this week, so I'm going to sit Golden Tate here versus the Washington Football Team. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I'm going to start Noah Fant from the Denver Broncos playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Noah Fant has averaged 12.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.2 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 73% of the snaps. He's projected at 10.7 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $4,600 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Denver Broncos trailing by 4. So fantastic matchup here. Should be a passing game script. So I'm going to start Noah Fant here versus the Atlanta Falcons. I'm also going to start Jimmy Graham from the Chicago Bears playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the 14th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Jimmy Graham has averaged 9.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.1 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 70% of the snaps, and he got 7, 6, and 8 pass targets in the last 3 games. He hasn't turned those pass targets into a ton of fantasy point production yet, but I think that touchdown is coming, and he's projected at 9.2 fantasy points here in week 9. He's only $3,800 DraftKings salary and $1,500 more on FanDuel. So Vegas thinks there's going to be 46.5 points scored in this game, with the Chicago Bears trailing by 5.5. So decent matchup here in a passing game script. I think that touchdown is coming, so I'm going to start Jimmy Graham here versus the Tennessee Titans. I'm also going to start Logan Thomas from the Washington football team playing the New York Giants, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Logan Thomas has averaged 8.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.7 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 85% of the snaps, projected at 8 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $3,700 DraftKings salary and $1,300 more on FanDuel. So he's been getting a consistent 4 pass targets per game for the last 3 weeks. He scored 16 fantasy points last week, 13 fantasy points the game before that. I think he makes a nice start at tight end if you're struggling at the tight end position. So I'm going to start Logan Thomas here versus the New York Giants. Okay, who are we going to sit at the tight end position? I'm going to sit Mike Gesicki from the Miami Dolphins playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Mike Gesicki has averaged 9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.6 pass targets per game. Now, he's only on the field for 58% of the snaps. Now, he only scored 2 and 0 fantasy points in the last 2 games off of 2 pass targets in each of those games. He's projected at 8.9 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $4,400 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Miami Dolphins trailing by 4.5. So not a great matchup here, a low-scoring game. It should be a passing game script, but Mike Gesicki's just not getting enough passing volume, only 2 pass targets the last 2 games. Too much of a risk for me to play in my fantasy lineup, so I'm going to sit Mike Gesicki here versus the Arizona Cardinals.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video, or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.